Keanu Reeves sat quietly in the corner of one of Los Angeles's most luxurious hotel dining rooms, just another face in the crowd, until a sharp voice shattered the calm. Across the room, a wealthy socialite was berating a young maid for accidentally spilling a glass of water. Her words were loud, cruel, and dripping with entitlement. "You should be grateful you even have a job here," she sneered, her voice echoing off the marble walls as the entire room fell silent. Guests stared, some in shock, others pretending not to notice. But Keanu noticed. While everyone else averted their eyes, hoping the moment would pass, Keanu stood up, calm, steady. The room froze as he walked across the floor, his simple jeans and worn boots a stark contrast to the glittering suits and dresses around him. No one expected what happened next. But by the time it was over, the entire hotel, and the woman who thought her money could buy respect, would never be the same. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story, so after watching, leave a comment below and tell us what you think. And don't forget, tomorrow, we have another inspiring story just for you. The golden morning light streamed through the towering windows of the Avalon, one of Los Angeles's most prestigious hotels. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting delicate patterns across the marble floor of the dining hall. The room was filled with the quiet clinking of cutlery, soft conversations, and the faint rustle of designer fabrics. Every detail radiated luxury, from the polished silverware to the elegantly dressed guests sipping their imported coffee. At a table near the window overlooking the bustling city below sat Victoria Langford. She was the picture of wealth and privilege, her Hermes scarf perfectly draped over her shoulders, a diamond bracelet glittering with every casual flick of her wrist. She barely glanced up from her phone, lazily scrolling through messages, exuding the air of someone who believed the world revolved. Across the room, Maria, a young maid in a crisp uniform, carefully navigated between the tables, balancing a tray of empty glasses. Her movements were precise, but the exhaustion in her eyes hinted at long hours and hard days. As she approached Victoria's table, fate intervened. One of the glasses on her tray wobbled and, before she could steady it, tipped over, spilling a splash of cold water onto Victoria's pristine scarf. The room went silent. Victoria shot up from her seat, her voice slicing through the quiet like a knife. "Are you kidding me?" she shrieked, staring in horror at the damp spot on her scarf. "Do you have any idea how much this costs? This is Hermes, you idiot!" Her voice grew louder, drawing the attention of every guest in the room. "People like you shouldn't even be allowed to work here." Maria's face flushed with humiliation. She stammered an apology, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. It was an accident." But Victoria wasn't interested in apologies. "An accident?" she mocked, laughing bitterly. "That's what you people always say. Maybe if you paid more attention, you wouldn't be so useless." The words hung in the air, sharp and cruel. Maria's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but found only the cold stares of the wealthy patrons. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke up, until a chair scraped back from a table in the corner. At first, no one paid much attention to the man who stood up. He was dressed simply, faded jeans, a plain black t-shirt, and scuffed boots that looked wildly out of place among the designer suits and glittering jewelry. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and his expression calm, almost indifferent. But as he approached, the room began to stir. People whispered, glancing at him with growing recognition. When he finally stopped beside Maria, standing protectively at her side, Victoria's furious expression faltered. Because standing there, in the middle of the Avalon's grand dining hall, was Keanu Reeves. A hush fell over the room. Victoria's mouth opened, ready to say something clever, but no words came out. The confidence that had filled her just moments ago drained from her face as Keanu's calm, steady gaze met hers. He turned to Maria first, offering her a gentle, reassuring smile. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice carrying just enough for everyone to hear. Maria nodded weakly, too stunned to speak. Then Keanu turned back to Victoria. His voice was still quiet, but there was a sharpness beneath the calm, like steel wrapped in silk. "Was that really necessary?" he asked, his words cutting deeper than any shout could have. "Accidents happen. That doesn't give you the right to treat someone like that." Victoria blinked, struggling to find her voice, but the room was no longer on her side. Keanu's quiet strength had shifted the entire atmosphere. Guests who had previously stayed silent now looked at Maria with sympathy, while others stared at Victoria with thinly veiled disgust. Keanu didn't wait for a response. He gave Maria a small, encouraging nod and turned back to his table, leaving Victoria standing there, speechless and humiliated. The room slowly came back to life, but nothing was the same. Because in that moment, everything had changed. After the incident in the Avalon's grand dining hall, the atmosphere remained heavy. Though conversations resumed and cutlery clinked against plates, the tension lingered like a shadow. But behind that brief, explosive moment was a story much deeper than a spilled glass of water. Maria Alvarez wasn't just any maid working at the Avalon. At 26, she had seen more struggle than many in that luxurious room could imagine. Born in a small town just outside of Guadalajara, Mexico, Maria grew up in a modest home where every peso counted. Her parents worked tirelessly, her father as a mechanic and her mother as a seamstress, instilling in Maria a strong work ethic and an unshakable sense of responsibility. But life had other plans. When Maria was only 18, her father fell ill. The medical bills piled up quickly, and despite her mother's endless hours at the sewing machine, it wasn't enough. Maria had just started college, hoping to become a teacher, but with her father's health deteriorating and her younger brother, Luis, still in school, she made the difficult decision to drop out and move to the United States. She believed that even the lowest-paying job in America would help her family more than any degree could. She arrived in Los Angeles with nothing but a suitcase full of second-hand clothes and a heart full of hope. The first year was the hardest. Maria worked as a dishwasher, a grocery store cashier, and even cleaned houses during the weekends. She lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment with two other women who were in similar situations, sending every extra dollar back home to her family in Mexico. Eventually, she landed a job as a housekeeper at the Avalon, a position she never imagined she'd hold in a place filled with such opulence. But Maria took pride in her work. She was meticulous, respectful, and always wore a warm, genuine smile, even when exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders. She dreamed of saving enough to return to school one day, but for now, her focus was on supporting her family. Her father's health had stabilized, but Luis was preparing to attend university, a luxury Maria wanted to afford him without burden. Maria's colleagues at the Avalon admired her dedication. She was the first to volunteer for extra shifts and the last to leave when work piled up. She never complained, even when dealing with difficult guests. But no amount of hard work could shield her from moments like the one with Victoria Langford. Victoria, on the other hand, lived in a world far removed from Maria's. Born into old money, Victoria had never known a day of struggle. Her father was a real estate mogul who owned properties across the globe, while her mother was a former beauty queen turned philanthropist, though most of her charity work was little more than a photo opportunity. Victoria had grown up in penthouses, attended private schools, and vacationed on yachts. She believed that wealth wasn't just a privilege, it was a right. Her attitude reflected that belief. Victoria had a reputation in elite circles for her sharp tongue and entitlement. Waiters, hotel staff, even personal assistants, all were beneath her in her eyes. She believed that people in service roles existed solely to cater to her whims, and that any mistakes were unforgivable offenses against her status. She'd humiliated plenty of employees before, but none of those incidents had ever made her pause or reflect. But this time was different. Keanu Reeves had seen everything. Keanu Reeves, of course, wasn't just another guest at the Avalon. Known for his humility despite global fame, Keanu had always been deeply connected to people from all walks of life. His journey hadn't been without hardship either. Keanu had faced personal losses, his father's abandonment at a young age, the tragic death of his daughter, and later, the passing of his partner, Jennifer Syme. These events shaped him, grounding him in a way that Hollywood often failed to do for its stars. What many didn't know was that Keanu's own mother, Patricia Taylor, had once worked as a costume designer and part-time housekeeper to support her family after moving to Canada. Keanu knew firsthand the struggles of women like Maria, women who toiled behind the scenes to make the lives of others more comfortable, while often being overlooked or, worse, mistreated. This personal connection made it impossible for Keanu to stay silent when he saw Maria being humiliated. He recognized the look in her eyes, the same one he'd seen in his mother's when she came home exhausted but determined to provide for her family. Keanu wasn't one to seek confrontation, but when faced with injustice, especially towards someone defenseless, he couldn't stand idly by. Later that day, Maria found herself replaying the incident in her mind. The sting of Victoria's words still lingered, but Keanu's kindness had left an even deeper mark. She had recognized him the moment he approached. Who wouldn't? But it wasn't his fame that mattered to her. It was the quiet respect in his eyes, the way he spoke to her like she mattered, like her dignity was worth defending. Meanwhile, Victoria sat in her penthouse suite, staring out at the city skyline. She had faced public embarrassment before, but this felt different. The room's silence after Keanu's words haunted her more than she wanted to admit. For the first time, someone hadn't just dismissed her behavior, they'd challenged it. And worse, the entire room had agreed. Victoria had spent her whole life believing that wealth and power shielded her from consequences. But that morning at the Avalon, she realized that sometimes it took nothing more than a spilled glass and a simple man in scuffed boots to remind her that respect wasn't something you could buy. And somewhere deep down, that realization unsettled her more than she cared to admit. The aftermath of the morning's confrontation at the Avalon hung like a thick fog over the opulent dining hall. Though the guests resumed their meals, the incident replayed in everyone's minds. The sight of Keanu Reeves standing up for a maid against one of the city's wealthiest women had been nothing short of extraordinary. But for Maria and Victoria, the story was far from over. Maria tried to shake off the encounter as she returned to her duties. The manager, Mr. Harrington, a stern man in his 50s with a perpetual frown etched into his face, had seen the entire episode. While he didn't say much at first, Maria could sense his disapproval, not for Victoria's behavior, but for the attention the incident had drawn. "Maria!" He called her into his office after the lunch rush. The small room smelled of polished wood and expensive cologne, a stark contrast to the bustling hotel floors. "Yes, Mr. Harrington," Maria replied, nervously wringing her hands. "I heard what happened this morning," he began, folding his hands over his desk. "You've been a good worker, but we cater to a specific clientele here. People like Ms. Langford expect perfection. You need to be more careful." Maria felt her heart sink. She had hoped for some empathy, maybe even support after being publicly humiliated. Instead, it felt like the blame was shifting onto her. "I understand, sir. It won't happen again," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Harrington gave a curt nod. "See that it doesn't. We can't afford any more scenes." Maria left the office feeling even smaller than she had that morning. The humiliation from Victoria's words still burned, but now it was layered with the cold indifference of her employer. She thought about her family back home. Her father, whose health had been fragile for years, and her younger brother, Luis, who was so close to starting university. She couldn't afford to lose this job, no matter how unfairly she was treated. Meanwhile, Victoria Langford wasn't used to being the subject of whispers and sideways glances. After Keanu's intervention, she had left the dining hall in a flurry, retreating to her lavish penthouse suite on the top floor of the Avalon. But the more she tried to dismiss the incident, the more it gnawed at her. She poured herself a glass of vintage champagne, pacing the marble floor as the city sprawled beneath her through floor-to-ceiling windows. Her phone buzzed incessantly. Texts from friends asking about the scene in the dining hall, snide remarks about Keanu Reeves, and even a few subtle jabs at her behavior. "Can you believe he stood up for a maid? That was so awkward, Vic. What happened? Maybe you went a bit too far this time?" Victoria tossed her phone onto the plush couch with a frustrated sigh. She wasn't used to being on the defensive. In her world, wealth and status always guaranteed control. But Keanu's calm, piercing words had struck a nerve, not because of who he was, but because of how he said them. He hadn't raised his voice or caused a scene, he had simply held up a mirror. And, for the first time, Victoria didn't like what she saw. But instead of introspection, anger bubbled to the surface. Who did he think he was? Just because he was a famous actor didn't give him the right to humiliate her in front of everyone? And that maid, Maria, should have been grateful she wasn't fired on the spot. Victoria decided she wasn't going to let this go. No one embarrassed Victoria Langford without consequences. The next day, Maria's shift started earlier than usual. She hoped the incident had blown over, but as she walked into the staff area, whispers followed her like shadows. "There she is, the girl from yesterday," someone muttered. "I heard she almost got fired," another added. Maria kept her head down, pretending not to hear, but inside her stomach churned. She just needed to get through the day. As she stepped into the lobby, her heart sank. Victoria Langford was standing at the concierge desk, her sharp eyes locking onto Maria the moment she appeared. Victoria's lips curled into a cold, triumphant smile. "Oh, there you are," Victoria's voice rang out, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Maria, isn't it?" Maria froze, her cheeks flushing as guests and staff alike turned to watch. "Yes, ma'am," she replied quietly. Victoria sauntered over, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She looked Maria up and down, her expression dripping with condescension. "I wanted to make sure you remembered me," Victoria sneered. "After all, it's not every day someone like you gets the chance to humiliate herself in front of Keanu Reeves, is it?" Maria felt her face burn, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean—" "Oh, I'm sure you didn't," Victoria interrupted, her tone saccharine and mocking. "But you see, accidents have consequences, and I don't think someone with your skill set belongs in a place like this." Before Maria could respond, Mr. Harrington appeared, his expression unreadable. "Is there a problem here, Ms. Langford?" he asked, though his eyes flicked toward Maria as if she were already guilty. Victoria's smile widened. "Not at all. I was just expressing my concerns about the staff's professionalism." Harrington gave a tight nod, turning to Maria. "Maria, why don't you take a break?" Maria opened her mouth to protest, but thought better of it. With a quiet nod, she retreated to the back, her heart pounding in her chest. But fate wasn't finished intervening. Later that afternoon, as Maria was cleaning one of the private suites, there was a soft knock at the door. Expecting it to be another staff member, she opened it and froze. Keanu Reeves stood there, his calm eyes meeting hers. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said gently. Maria blinked, struggling to find her voice. "No, sir. I mean, Mr. Reeves. You're not. How can I help you?" Keanu gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Actually, I was hoping to... Maria stepped aside, letting him in, her mind racing with questions. Why was he here? What did he want? Keanu looked around the room briefly before turning back to her. "I saw what happened downstairs," he said softly. "And yesterday. I just wanted to make sure you're okay." Maria felt a lump form in her throat. No one had ever cared enough to ask her that, especially not someone like him. She nodded, blinking back tears. "I'm fine," she whispered. "Thank you." Keanu studied her for a moment, then added, "You don't deserve to be treated like that. No one does." His words were simple, but they carried a weight Maria couldn't ignore. In that moment, something shifted inside her. She wasn't just a maid. She was a person who deserved respect, no matter how much money someone like Victoria Langford had. And she wasn't going to let this go, not anymore. The next day, Maria returned to the Avalon with mixed feelings. The sting of humiliation from Victoria Langford was still fresh, but Keanu Reeves' quiet support gave her strength. She kept her head down, hoping the incident had passed. But Victoria wasn't one to let things go. Later that morning, while Maria polished silverware in the dining hall, Victoria arrived, her sharp heels echoing ominously against the marble floor. She approached Maria with a smug grin, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Well, if it isn't my favorite maid," Victoria sneered. "Still here? I thought you'd have been fired by now." Maria felt her cheeks burn but forced herself to stay calm. She turned to Victoria, her voice steady. "I'm here to do my job, ma'am, not to be humiliated." The room went silent. Victoria's eyes narrowed, unprepared for Maria's newfound courage. Before Victoria could respond, a familiar voice echoed from the entrance. "He's right, you know." Everyone turned. Keanu Reeves stood in the doorway, his calm gaze fixed on Victoria. He walked to Maria's side, his presence commanding the room. "I don't understand why some people think money gives them the right to disrespect others," Keanu said softly but firmly. "Maria works hard. She deserves respect." Victoria scoffed, trying to regain control. "Oh, please, you're just an actor. This isn't one of your movies." Keanu smiled, unfazed. "Exactly. This is real life, and in real life, kindness matters. So instead of lying here trembling and contracting, we should act and think, and everything else matters." The weight of his words hung in the air. Even the hotel manager, Mr. Harrington, stepped forward, his face tight with authority. "Ms. Langford," he said, his voice cold, "I think it's time you checked out." The room gasped. Victoria's eyes widened in disbelief. "You've caused enough trouble," Harrington added. "Your behavior is unacceptable." Victoria sputtered but saw no support in the room. She shot Maria a venomous glare. "This isn't over." With that, she stormed out, her exit met with stunned silence. As the doors closed behind her, the tension in the room eased. Keanu turned to Maria, offering a gentle smile. "You did great," he said. "I just stood by you." Maria felt tears prick her eyes. For once, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. And sometimes all it takes is one person standing by your side to change everything. The fallout from Victoria Langford's dramatic exit at the Avalon reverberated through the halls for days. For most guests, it became nothing more than an amusing anecdote, a story to tell at their next dinner party about how Keanu Reeves had humiliated one of LA's most notorious socialites. But for Maria, it marked the beginning of something much deeper. It was the first time she realized she didn't have to accept disrespect as a condition of her job. However, Victoria wasn't someone who would fade quietly into the background. She was used to getting her way, and the public embarrassment stung more than she cared to admit. What Keanu had done wasn't just a personal slight, it was a public one, and in her world, reputation was everything. A week after the incident, Maria was starting to feel a sense of normalcy return. The whispers had died down, and even Mr. Harrington, who had previously scolded her for the incident, seemed to keep his distance. Maria found herself working with more confidence, even smiling more freely with guests and colleagues. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. One morning, as Maria arrived for her shift, she noticed something unusual. A sleek black car was parked out front, its tinted windows reflecting the morning sun. It wasn't uncommon for luxury cars to line the entrance of the Avalon, but something about this one felt off. She brushed it off and entered the building, focusing on her tasks. But by mid-morning, whispers began circulating among the staff. Victoria Langford was back. Maria's heart sank when she overheard the news. Why would she come back after everything that happened? But the answer became clear soon enough. Victoria wasn't here to stay. She was here to retaliate. Around noon, Maria was cleaning a suite on the 3rd floor when her walkie-talkie crackled to life. "Maria, please report to the lobby," a voice instructed. It was Mr. Harrington, his tone clipped and formal. Maria's stomach twisted, but she took a deep breath and made her way downstairs. As she entered the lobby, the sight that greeted her sent a chill down her spine. Victoria stood at the front desk, her expression one of icy satisfaction. Beside her was a man Maria didn't recognize, tall, with a stern face and an expensive suit that screamed authority. He held a clipboard in one hand and a briefcase in the other. "Ah, there she is," Victoria said, her voice dripping with false sweetness as Maria approached. Maria stood tall, refusing to show fear. "You asked for me, Mr. Harrington?" Before the manager could respond, Victoria stepped forward. "This is Mr. Collins," she announced, gesturing to the man beside her. "He's a representative from the hotel board of directors. I've filed a formal complaint against you and the management of this establishment for gross unprofessionalism." Maria's heart pounded in her chest. A formal complaint? This wasn't just about her anymore. Victoria was trying to drag the entire hotel into her vendetta. Mr. Collins cleared his throat, flipping through his clipboard. We take all guest complaints seriously, especially from our VIP clients. We'll be conducting a thorough investigation into the incident that occurred last week. Maria felt the weight of the room pressing down on her. She glanced at Mr. Harrington, hoping for support, but his face remained unreadable. Hours later, Maria found herself in the break room, her hands trembling as she tried to process what had just happened. She had given everything to this job, her time, her energy, her pride, and now it felt like it could all be taken away because of one powerful woman's bruised ego. But just as despair threatened to overtake her, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and stared at the screen, her heart skipping a beat. It was a message from Keanu. Heard about what's happening. Don't worry, I've got an idea. Meet me after your shift. Maria's breath hitched. She didn't know what Keanu had planned, but something about his calm confidence gave her hope. She wasn't alone in this. Not anymore. Later that evening, after her shift ended, Maria met Keanu in the small cafe across the street from the hotel. He greeted her with his usual warm smile, but there was a seriousness in his eyes she hadn't seen before. They're trying to intimidate you, Keanu said, stirring his coffee. But they're forgetting one thing. Maria tilted her head, curious. What's that? Keanu leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. The truth always comes out. He pulled out his phone and showed Maria a video. Her eyes widened as she watched the footage. It was the moment Victoria had humiliated her in the dining hall, followed by Keanu's intervention. But it wasn't just any video. It was shot from multiple angles, clearly captured by different guests who had witnessed the incident. I've been sent dozens of these in the past week, Keanu explained. People were shocked by how she treated you, and they're ready to speak up. Maria felt a surge of emotion. For the first time, the power imbalance didn't feel so insurmountable. Keanu placed a reassuring hand on hers. You don't have to fight this alone, Maria. We're going to make sure everyone knows the truth. As Maria walked home that night, a sense of resolve settled over her. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore. She was standing up for every person who had ever been made to feel small, for every worker who had been treated as invisible. Victoria Langford thought she could use her power to crush anyone in her path. But this time, she had underestimated her opponent, and the battle was just beginning. The next morning, Maria felt a mix of nerves and determination as she arrived at the Avalon. She wasn't sure what Keanu Reeves had planned, but she trusted him. His calm assurance gave her the courage to walk through the grand lobby with her head held high, even as whispers followed her. By noon, it was clear something was happening. Guests in the dining hall were glued to their phones, murmuring in hushed tones. Staff exchanged wide-eyed glances, and even Mr. Harrington seemed unusually tense. Maria's heart pounded as she moved through the hotel, sensing the growing tension but not yet knowing the cause. Then her phone buzzed. It was a message from Keanu. Turn on the TV in the staff lounge. Now, Maria rushed to the break room, her hands trembling as she grabbed the remote. The moment the screen flickered to life, her breath caught in her throat. It was all over the news. A popular morning show had picked up the story. Footage of the dining hall incident played on loop. Victoria's cruel words, Maria's quiet humiliation, and Keanu stepping in to defend her. But it wasn't just one video. Dozens of angles from different guests had surfaced online, painting a clear picture of Victoria's behavior. The headlines were brutal. Hollywood star defends maid from socialites' cruelty. Keanu Reeves shames billionaire heiress in viral showdown. The Avalon scandal, how one maid's humiliation sparked a movement. Maria's phone buzzed again, this time with messages from friends and even strangers offering support. Her social media was flooded with kind words and calls for justice. She felt overwhelmed, but empowered. But the biggest shock came next. Keanu had done more than just share the videos. He had spoken directly to reporters. In the interview, Keanu didn't just talk about Maria's experience. He spoke about the invisible struggles of workers everywhere. The people who cleaned hotel rooms, served coffee, and worked behind the scenes to keep the world turning. His words were heartfelt and sincere, and they resonated far beyond the Avalon's walls. "The way we treat people who serve us reflects who we are," Keanu said in the interview. "Respect isn't a privilege, it's a basic human right." By the afternoon, the hotel was in chaos. Victoria Langford had been bombarded by reporters outside her penthouse. She tried to deny everything, but the footage spoke louder than her carefully crafted lies. Her social media accounts were flooded with backlash, and even her closest allies began to distance themselves from the scandal. Meanwhile, the Avalon's management was forced to respond. Mr. Harrington called Maria into his office, his usual stern demeanor replaced with an awkward stiffness. "Maria," he began, clearing his throat, "we'd like to apologize for how things were handled. You've been an exemplary employee, and we value your contributions here." Maria blinked in surprise. Was this the same man who had scolded her for causing a scene just days ago? Before she could respond, Keanu entered the room, his presence filling the space with quiet authority. "Maria deserves more than an apology," Keanu said calmly. "She deserves recognition and a raise." Mr. Harrington's face paled, but he nodded quickly, eager to avoid further bad press. Of course, we will make the necessary adjustments." Maria felt a mix of disbelief and gratitude. She never expected this outcome, but it felt right. A few days later, Maria found herself standing at the front of the dining hall, not as a maid, but as a guest of honor. The hotel had arranged a small ceremony to publicly recognize her hard work and resilience. Keanu stood beside her, offering quiet support as she accepted the award. But the real reward wasn't the plaque or the applause. It was the knowledge that she had stood up for herself and that her story had inspired others to do the same. As the ceremony ended, Keanu leaned over and whispered, "You changed more than just your life, Maria. You changed everything." And for the first time in a long while, Maria believed it. In the days following the media frenzy, the Avalon wasn't the same. The hotel, once a symbol of untouchable luxury and silent hierarchies, had undergone a transformation. The staff noticed it first. Guests were more polite, smiles were genuine, and the invisible barrier between service and customer had begun to crack. But the biggest change was in Maria Alvarez's life. Maria had been offered more than just a raise. Mr. Harrington, under pressure from the board and public scrutiny, promoted her to supervisor of housekeeping. It wasn't just a title. It came with better pay, more manageable hours, and most importantly, respect. Her colleagues, once wary of standing out, now looked at her with admiration. Maria wasn't just a maid anymore. She was a symbol of quiet strength and resilience. But the transformation wasn't just professional. With her newfound confidence, Maria finally allowed herself to dream again. She reopened her college applications, determined to finish her degree in education. Her brother, Luis, who had followed the story from Mexico, called her in tears. "You're my hero, Maria," he had said. And for the first time, she believed it. As for Victoria Langford, her fall from grace had been swift and merciless. After her behavior went viral, brands distanced themselves, charity boards dropped her name, and her socialite circle grew cold. The woman who once ruled LA's elite parties found herself unwelcome in the very spaces she believed she owned. But the most unexpected part? She disappeared. Rumors swirled about her fleeing to Europe or retreating to one of her family's private islands, but no one knew for sure. It seemed that even someone as powerful as Victoria couldn't escape the consequences of her actions when the world decided to hold her accountable. One sunny afternoon, about a month after the incident, Maria sat at a small cafe near the Avalon. She stared out at the bustling streets of Los Angeles, sipping her coffee, when a familiar figure slid into the seat across from her. Keanu Reeves. "Hey," he greeted with his usual soft smile. Maria laughed, shaking her head. "You know, I still can't believe this is real." Keanu chuckled. "Me neither." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the city move around them. Finally, Maria spoke. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Not just for standing up for me, but for reminding me that I deserve better." Keanu's eyes softened. "You didn't need me to remind you, Maria. You've always had that strength. I just gave you a little nudge."
Maria smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest. She had faced humiliation, stood up to power, and emerged stronger. But more than that, she realized she wasn't alone. In a city that often felt cold and indifferent, there were people like Keanu, people who saw the value in kindness, in respect. As they finished their coffee, Keanu stood up, pulling on his jacket. Before leaving, he turned to her one last time. "Keep being you, Maria. The world needs more people like you." And with that, he disappeared into the crowd, leaving Maria with a heart full of gratitude and a future full of promise. Maria walked home that evening, the city lights reflecting off the pavement like stars scattered across the ground. She thought about how much had changed in such a short time. But the biggest change wasn't in her job or the people around her. It was in herself. She had learned that no matter how small you feel, your voice matters. And sometimes all it takes is a little courage and maybe a helping hand from someone who believes in you to change everything. Months after the incident at the Avalon, Maria's story continued to inspire people far beyond Los Angeles. The viral videos had sparked conversations around the world about respect, dignity, and the invisible labor that keeps society running. Maria went on to finish her degree in education, fulfilling a dream she once thought impossible. She even started a small community fund to support workers like her, people whose hard work often went unnoticed. As for Keanu Reeves, he never sought praise for his actions. When asked in interviews, he simply shrugged and said, "Kindness doesn't cost anything." But for Maria, his kindness had been priceless. It reminded her, and everyone watching, that standing up for what's right doesn't require fame or fortune, just a willingness to see the humanity in others.
And in a world often divided by status and wealth, that simple act changed everything.